Okay, last time we were talking about Paul and weakness of will. And today I want to come back to that discussion just briefly to remind us that what Paul contributes is not just this distinction between spirit and flesh, and recasting the question so that it says the main questions of how is this possible, but rather what can you do about it. There's something else that he does that's really quite different from the accounts in the ancient philosophers. He focuses on the question of responsibility. Now, the question of what you ought to do and the question of moral responsibility, those are two different questions. They're not the same thing. For example, there are times when you might say you don't do the right thing, but it's not your fault. We don't hold you responsible. And there are other times we might hold you responsible, even though, in a certain sense, you did what, from your own point of view, seemed to be the right thing. Now, let's think about the first sort of example. When would you say somebody had done something wrong, but nevertheless we don't hold them responsible? Maybe someone has done something wrong, or he loads it too much. Something has gone wrong, okay? Somebody has not done what they ought to do. Nevertheless, we don't hold them responsible.
We don't necessarily have free will.
Good, where you don't have free will, you don't have another choice. Okay, so maybe you were forced to do it. Maybe somebody was coercing you into it, or maybe it was just a natural circumstance that you had no other choice. So that would be one case where we might say, well, if the person had to do it, they weren't really acting fully voluntarily, so we don't hold them responsible, even though they did the wrong thing. Are there other cases where you might say, look, the person really internally couldn't have thought about it otherwise, in a sense? I don't mean they didn't have freedom, but they were doing the right thing from their own internal point of view. Nevertheless, we hold them responsible because it turned out what they did was the wrong thing. Yeah?
There could have been a bystander walking across the street, and that person ran that person over. That person in the car ran that person over.
Okay, good. And maybe the person was, dressed in something dark, hard to see, and so from the person's point of view, they really weren't doing. I mean, any of us, let's say, in the driver's seat might have done the same thing. Nevertheless, you might hold the person responsible. Now, in one sense, you might say, look, there could have been any of us. And yet, it might be that if the consequences are bad enough, we would hold the person responsible in some way. And so these questions of responsibility are complicated and different from simply the question of right or wrong, what you ought to do and what you ought not to do. But Paul puts it in this context because he realizes there is a connection. And he's interested in the following question. Suppose I give in to temptation. Suppose I display weakness of will. To what extent am I responsible for the result? Now, on the one hand, you could say, look, I nevertheless do it, and so there's some responsibility. On the other hand, you might say, at least the person who's trying to do the right thing. The person who is trying, for example, to stay on their diet, but occasionally fail, somehow seems better than the person who isn't even trying, right? Or the person who's trying to be faithful to someone, but slips up, that seems somehow better than the person who just says, I'm not even going to try. Actually, last week was very disturbing. I went up to my office, someone was crying outside my door, and this girl was talking, I can't repeat the language she was using because it was inappropriate for audiences of any level. But she was basically saying, look, my boyfriend's been unfaithful to me again and again and again, and he's having lunch today with this other girl. But nevertheless, I know he loves me. I was thinking, oh, sweetheart. Well, the point really is, look, it's somehow better, right? If somebody's trying to be faithful and in general, but something happened, okay? Then the person's like making no attempt at all, and cheating again and again, and making no effort whatever to be faithful. So there are degrees of responsibility here, and Paul says, what's the connection? How important is it to be trying to do the right thing? How important is it to actually succeed in doing the right thing? Now that raises an important philosophical question that I want to focus on. Not only is he concerned with the question of responsibility, but he is also drawing a distinction we've touched upon before between internal conceptions and external conceptions. By talking about what is internal here, I mean what has to do with somebody's state of mind. And by referring to the external, I mean to talk about behavior. In his terms, this is going to be a question of faith, or trying to do the right thing in that moral context. The external is going to become the law, what you actually do. But really, this contrast between faith and the law that goes throughout Romans is in some sense a contrast between internal perspectives and external perspectives. Now, I think that's something that has huge philosophical significance, quite apart from and going far beyond what appears directly here in Romans. There is a way of understanding a lot of philosophical puzzles as revolving around cases where the internal and the external don't match up in the proper way. For example, philosophy of language. Internally, you're thinking about some particular thing, right? Or let's say a particular person. You have somebody in mind. But what if the reality doesn't match up? What if there is no such person? Then you've got the problem of non-referring names, non-existent objects. Fiction, say. Or suppose more than one thing corresponds to this. Let's say you've got some concept of some king in the ancient world, and it turns out that wasn't one person. There were actually several persons who went under that title. What you're mistaking as a name was really a title that a number of different people had held. Then your thought doesn't match up to language in the expected way, and all sorts of interesting puzzles in the philosophy of language and in metaphysics arise from that. In epistemology, it's something like the same thing. You're doing your best, you're drawing the right inference from the evidence you have. Nevertheless, the world doesn't match up. Internally, you look like a good knower, but maybe the connection you have to the world isn't really the right connection. Or, in the reverse, maybe your belief matches up to the world, but nevertheless, we don't count it as knowledge because there's not quite the right internal state of mind. You have a belief, the belief is true. Nevertheless, we might say it's not knowledge because of something about your own internal state of mind. Well, the same thing happens in ethics. It might be that you have the right internal state, you're trying to do the right thing, but nevertheless you screw up in behavior through weakness of will or just through ignorance. You thought you were helping somebody by giving them this medicine when it turned out it was poison. So, to take an example from It's a Wonderful Life. Or maybe you think that what you're saying is really going to be helpful to someone, when in fact it's hurtful and it's not helpful at all. You're trying to do the right thing, but you're screwing up. Or maybe you're trying to do something wrong, but in the end it's beneficial. Maybe you're angry and you say something you regret, but actually the person really needed to hear it. Or my favorite example of this, The Simpsons, Moe is upset that Mr. Burns is insisting on bowling in the final championship game, and so he thinks, I've got to stop Mr. Burns, he'll destroy our chances, he's a terrible bowler. He leaps out of the men's room with a tie wire as Mr. Burns comes into the bowling alley, he smashes him on the knee. He's trying to harm Mr. Burns, he's trying to knock him out of the tournament. In fact, he hits him, runs away. Mr. Burns says, Smithers, I thought I wasn't going to be able to play, but that fellow seems to have fixed my bum knee. I can play after all. Which is bad for the team, but good for Mr. Burns, presumably. So, you can be trying to do something bad and nevertheless somehow do something good. You can be trying to do something good and nevertheless do something bad. These don't necessarily match up, and interesting puzzles arise when they don't. Now, Paul's question is actually one that does rely on this distinction, but not exactly in that sort of way. He's concerned with the question of justification, which is where we ended up last time. And this is something that runs throughout the Christian tradition. It becomes a very important concept. But what does it mean? We have some idea of what justification means in epistemology. You have some warrant, you have some evidence. That's not what it means here. The question of justification, to put it in crude practical terms, is the question of whether you get into heaven. Okay? But what it really means, the term being introduced this way, has to do with, well, yeah, being judged. Okay? The idea is that it's connected to responsibility. How do we judge someone? You are going to be judged, and the thought here is an old rabbinical thought. Know where you come from and where you're going before whom you'll have to give account, says one of the rabbis in the Ethics of the Fathers. And that's the idea. Eventually, you will be judged. But notice we're judged within this world as well. So, in a certain sense, the question is one that doesn't depend on that. How does one evaluate someone and their behavior? How do you judge someone? The question of justification is being judged as being okay, being approved of. And so really, you might say, this is a question of being judged positively by us, or ultimately by God. And so, you are justified to the extent that you can be judged positively. You can be judged as, well, in positive moral terms rather than negative moral terms. Yes, by human beings, but also by God. And now the question becomes, well, what does it take to actually have a positive moral judgment? The thought is something like this. At the end of someone's life, you look at their life and you think, did they live well? What is your evaluation of the person? It's often complicated, right? In some respects, yes. In some respects, no. What are our criteria for evaluating another person? It's something that, in more or less formal ways, we do all the time. Judges actually have to do it when they judge someone's innocent or guilty and send them to prison to turn on punishment. But we do it all the time. Somebody acts like they'd like to be your friend. You think, do I want to be friends with this person? And there's some kind of judgment going on. It's dangerous, in my view, this sort of judgment, because you can easily make mistakes, and maybe the act of judging in certain contexts is itself wrong. Nevertheless, there's some sense in which we do this sort of thing all the time, but there's a vision that at the end of one's life, God does this in a kind of global way. So there's a sort of metaphysical power to this. But the question, as I want to stress, really occurs at both levels. It's not one that's distinct now. Now, what really makes a difference? Do we judge according to the law by external criteria? If you could watch a movie of someone's life, let's say, and just see from an external point of view what they've done, is that sufficient for judgment? Or do you need to know something about their internal state of mind? Is the internal state of mind sufficient? Let's start with our common sense conception. What do you think common sense indicates about this? Is it enough to look at what the person has done externally, or do you need the internal as well? Could you judge just from the internal, or do you need the external as well? Yeah.
I think, and I'm not sure if it's Romans, but I think Paul states that you gotta have both. So if you have just faith and you believe that maybe God exists, but then you kind of do whatever you want, that's not good, because it says, demons believe in God too, but they don't, that doesn't mean a lot. And then if you have just the law and you're really religious and just that, but don't love other people around you and don't love God, then that's also bad.
Okay, good. Yeah, so a common sense response to this might be to say, look, and I think in many ways you're right. That's what he advocates here, although there's a long tradition, as we'll see, about interpreting the relative strength of these. But yeah, the obvious sort of common sense view is, well, it's really both external and internal factors, right? I mean, suppose someone is a guard in a concentration camp, and they do horrible things. You look at the film and you say, oh my gosh, this person's doing terrible things to other human beings. But then internally, you investigate, and the person is troubled, is doing horribly good, feels as if they have no choice. That doesn't excuse it, but somehow it makes you feel differently from how you might feel if the person is actually enjoying this and wants to be taking part in this. The person might feel trapped in the system. Now, I don't want to say that has, it's a difficult question maybe to say what that means for that person morally speaking. There are all sorts of good people trapped in terrible circumstances. And it's hard to know what to say about some of those cases. But nevertheless, we might say, look, both seem relevant in some way. J.C.C. Smart, the utilitarian, came up with the following thought experiment. Suppose you have a world consisting of just one person. But now, here are two versions of the scenario. In one of these universes, that one person is a good person, but miserably unhappy. They think that all of these horrible things are going on around them, and so they're very sad. But in fact, they're a very good-hearted person. In this other universe, there is someone who is happy, but happy because they imagine that there are all sorts of creatures around them that they torment. They're sadistic, okay? So they go around thinking, ha-ha, look at that bug, I'll smash it. Ah, look at that frog, I'll pull off its legs. Ooh, look at that person, I'll go over and beat him up. And they love doing it. They think this is awesome. But of course, none of this is really happening. Who's better? Which universe is better, Smart asks. And well, actually, what's the answer to that question? Yeah.
Well, you just said there in the universe that there only exists one person, right? So,
right.
So then, how can that one person also, in turn, meet up with a bunch of other?
Well, they can't. They just imagine, right? They're deluded.
Oh, they imagine. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they just have this picture of their internal life. None of this is really happening. But they think they're really, going into this bar, picking a fight with some guy, punching him. And in fact, there's nobody there, right? If you were to watch the film, the person's just going to the ground. You know, and you think, huh, you could probably tell I'm a box. But although once I kicked somebody's butt in karate, I feel so, all right, good example. This actually works terribly well. Close friend of mine, Nick Asher, had a daughter who was, actually both daughters were very athletic. The younger daughter was especially athletic. She ended up competing in various international rock climbing competitions and so on. Anyway, she was at one point studying karate. And Nicholas said, attack her. Try to attack her. She can defend herself against anything. And I said, oh, Nicholas, she was like 12 or 13 years old at the time. I don't want to try to attack and beat up a 12-year-old girl. And so I said, no, listen, no, I'm not going to do that. He said, come on, you can't do it. Don't worry, you cannot possibly harm her. I said, well, really, no, I'm going to attack her. It seems wrong. And he said, look, don't worry about it. She can defend herself against anything. You will not possibly hurt her. And I said, but Nicholas, no. And he said, come on, you can do it. I mean, don't worry about it. She is so good. You won't touch her. And so I said, well, all right, look, I don't think this is a good idea. You insist. Okay. So there I am, you know, and she's just standing there. I kind of do this. And suddenly I go, and I club her. Right. Like, oh, great. So what did I do? It's terrible. I kicked this 12-year-old girl. And, you know, it felt awful. But I was, you know, really not trying to club her really hard. Well, actually, what this has to do with Smart's example. But I thought I was in one of these fictional scenarios where he says, it's okay, you can't, this won't have any effects. Like, look, no actual harm was over from you doing this. Really? Really? Okay. Awful. So anyway, yeah, how do you judge that? I feel really guilty about that, even though I wasn't trying to harm somebody. I kept warning them, no, look, don't do this. And my only exposure to karate is I watched Karate Kid. You know? And I didn't sit there and practice this myself until I went, okay, I've seen this in movies, so and that turned out to be enough. Maybe that's because of, and actually Corey Jewell told me this, it's much harder to defend against somebody who's incompetent. He does judo a lot. And if the person knows judo, then you can kind of know what to do. But if it's somebody like me who doesn't know anything, but has watched a couple of kung fu movies, then you have no idea what they're going to do. So it's unpredictable. But in any case, so maybe she was quite good and it was just that. It's something ridiculous and unpredictable. But anyhow, yeah, you might say, look, in judging that action, you have to think both what was my state of mind, and my state of mind was, look, I don't want to hurt her. This is not a good idea. And the internal, well, the external state, which was, I kicked this 12-year-old girl. So, anyway, yeah, this class is going to be filled with confessions. I can see it. Anyway, both of those you might think are relevant to really evaluating somebody. Now, in what kind of balance, though, and what's really primary? You could just say it's both, and there's nothing more to be said. But Paul doesn't really think that's right. In the end, he is going to be arguing that the internal is really the primary, that we're judged fundamentally on internal factors. Now, that is not to say he wants to assure us that the external doesn't make any difference. But his thesis is really that the internal is primary. So I think Paul is trying to say, yes, it's both. And people who favor justification by works, those who favor justification by faith, both groups can find a lot in Romans to go on and support their position. But I think in a sense he says, yeah, look, both things are relevant, but in some sense the internal is primary. And he gives us some arguments for that, which I want to elaborate today. He thinks the internal is the fundamental one, which is to say it's really primarily by faith that people are justified. And then, yeah, what about externally, what they do? They're following the law, good works. Well, that's something that's involved too, but it's going to follow he thinks from the right internal state of mind. Now, of course, various puzzles can arise. Well, what if the circumstances are bizarre in some way, and what you expect to follow from a good internal state of mind doesn't follow? So those philosophical puzzles can still arise, but let's look at the arguments before we get there. There are a number of different arguments he gives us in Romans, and Romans is different. It's really philosophical. It's really hard, and it's something that actually, for me, goes in and out of focus. There are times when I read it, I think, yeah, I get it, I understand what it's doing, and there are other times when it all goes out of focus, and I think, wait, I've lost the picture. So I will give you a version of this that I'm not claiming to be the complete story or the full account of what's going on here. I don't think I understand the full account, but here are some elements of this. There are a number of arguments, and the first one I want to focus on is a simple one, relative to the other anyway. It's a negative argument from sin. So the thought here is, well, in a way simple. He says, suppose the external account is right. Suppose the external were sufficient and justification is through the law. Then he says, if justification is through the law, then he thinks two things would follow from that. Now, what would follow from that? Before we go any further, what do you think would be the case? Suppose it's just a question of behavior. Do you keep the commandments? Do you follow the moral law? Is what you do acceptable? Actually, yeah, I shouldn't say it's a simple match between the internal and the external. That's what the law is somewhat broad. It's mostly external. It's mostly a question of what you do, but not entirely. We've already seen there are elements of the law that are internal. Like what?
Love.
Say it again.
Love.
Love your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. Love is something that's an internal state of mind, right? So the law here, notice, is itself partly external, partly internal. Yeah.
When you've been drinking, that's an internal state. You may not exhibit it externally, but you still have that in your body.
Okay, yes, the person who is drunk but really good at covering it up, you might say has a state of mind that's strongly affected by drinking, but maybe they manage externally not to appear that way. That would be an example of someone who we might say is able to follow the law externally, but not actually from an internal point of view. Here, if we sort of mean the civil law, you might be in violation of the civil law by being drunk, while nevertheless being able to behave okay so that no one detects it. Now, the moral law is like that too. There are commandments like do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness. Those have to do with behavior, they're external. But there are others that have to do with internal states of mind. Do not covet, for example, is the most famous one. So it's going to matter if this is both. And in that sense, what I've said about the internal and the external is an approximation. Actually, it's going to be crucial at a certain stage of his argument that there's an internal element to the law. Now, there are two things that he thinks follow from this. One is, if justification is through the law, no one can be justified. Basically, nobody can meet the demands of the law in this sense. Nobody's going to be able to do it. So if justification is through the law, everybody's going to be judged negatively. At the end of somebody's life, you can say, all right, let's evaluate this person from a moral point of view. Does anybody get straight A's? Answer, no. Now, we'll come back to his reasons for thinking that. That will require some separate argument. But, for the moment, let's just pause and realize we have to come back to that. The second thing he thinks that is crucial is that then Christ died for no purpose. Earlier when we were talking about the life and ministry of Jesus, we talked about all sorts of things that he did according to gospel accounts, but we didn't really talk about the end, since it wasn't directly something he did. Namely, he was resurrected. Okay? And Paul thinks that the central message of the Gospels is really about that. It's about eternal life. Okay? It's about conquest over death. What is the central problem of evil as it emerges, for example, in the discussions of Genesis? Why does it become a problem? God creates the world and it's good, according to the Genesis account, but it's quickly obvious that, well, evil things can happen. Think of the Cain and Abel story, for example. And there are a whole sequence throughout Genesis. Bad things can happen, even in this good world. How is that possible? Well, there are lots and lots of attempts, you might say, within that book, in Job, and in all sorts of other places, to deal with that problem. But Paul's idea is, look, in a certain sense, the problem of evil becomes a problem of mortality. If people didn't die, it wouldn't be so serious. Thomas Nagel said, I wouldn't mind dying so much if it weren't followed by death. And he's making a serious point. Dying, that might be a painful process in someone, but death is the state of not being. And so you might think, yeah, look, there's pain and suffering and so on. I'm not saying that's insignificant. But suppose you couldn't really go out of existence. Then you might say, that's a temporary condition. That would be okay. I could live with that, right? If I got to live. Well, in effect, Paul's saying is that's the promise of the gospel. You do get to live. Dying isn't followed by death. It's followed by something else. And so he takes that to be a very important and very central message for really understanding what human life is all about. But suppose justification just came through keeping the law. Then what was the point of that sacrifice on the cross? He doesn't really elaborate a full theory in Romans on what the purpose is. But there is an important premise, which is that Christ died for a purpose. That it wasn't purposeless. After all, if Jesus just came to say, follow the law, and then he died and was miraculously resurrected, suppose all the account there is true, well, what was the purpose of all of that? If it's, in the end, it just points you back to the law, that seems irrelevant. And a third premise seems, by the way, can people still see this, or do I need to write it on the top of it? Okay, since you are unwilling to say you can see it over here. Well, the other thing is, some can be justified. I don't think he really explicitly articulates that or says much to defend it. But he thinks that this good news wouldn't be very good news if some couldn't actually do it, right? It was like, look, I will have the promise of eternal life. Just kidding. Nobody can actually grasp it. So the thought is, well, some people will be justified. Christ did die for a purpose, but if that's true, then it follows that justification is not through the law alone. Now, so far we haven't shown that it's not through the law. Partially, it's just a claim that obeying the law is not sufficient. Okay? Something else might be required. But actually, even if we say, look, well, here we really have to look at why we think 1A is true. No one can be justified. But really, if keeping the law is necessary and no one can do it, then actually we've also got an argument that obeying the law is not necessary. And so it's not through the law alone, it's neither necessary nor sufficient, really, I think, what will emerge once we've seen the details of the support for that. Question? Yeah?
Just a clarification question. Does he think A is because it's impossible to follow the law?
Okay, good. Why 1A? Yeah. Why can nobody be justified through the law? I think you put your finger on one of these. Yeah, nobody can do it. Now, why can nobody do it? Why can nobody actually follow the law? Yeah.
Did Paul at this time, like, what about Jesus did Paul know? I mean, did Paul have writings, or did he just hear things? You know what I mean? Like, how did he know about Jesus? And didn't Jesus say something about a tree bearing good fruit, which kind of is along these same lines? Like, if something's good internally, it'll produce something good externally.
Right. So
did Paul know about that?
Well, good question. Paul knew a lot about Jesus from an early stage, but not entirely in a good way. Who was he? He was an educated Pharisee who took on the job of stamping out Christianity. Okay? And so he was somebody who was trying to figure out who were Christians, who were followers, turn them in, have them punished by the Roman authorities, and his goal was to stamp this out. Then he had the experience on the road to Damascus where he saw Jesus appear to him, and he suddenly said, wait, okay, he was blinded temporarily, he regains his sight, he accepts the truth of these gospel accounts. So what did he actually know? At that point he starts hanging around with followers of Jesus, but everything he's getting is now secondhand, okay, from people who were third-hand more. Yeah.
Although he claims to have actually been the gospel, he doesn't highlight it a lot. He claims to have talked to God directly, like being brought up into the third heaven and gone to Mount Sinai and all that for 3 years in Arabia before he met the apostles. So it's something that people don't tend to focus on, but he definitely claims to have had direct contact with Jesus Christ.
Right. Well, okay, good. Yeah, and he does certainly claim a kind of mystical experience that he takes to be a justification. I mean, he talks about witnesses to all of the gospel events, and here he means historical witnesses, people who were there, people who saw this. But then he also says, and I too was a witness, but of course in a different sense. He's not saying I was there, on the third day or anything like that. He's saying I have had this experience that constitutes a kind of evidence for myself. But yes, he is somebody who knows a lot about this, presumably, though much of it at any rate is secondhand. And now, how much exactly, and what's its relation to the actual gospel accounts? That's a difficult historical question. Modern scholarship, and let me quickly say here, I think modern scholarship is not fully trusted on this, but nevertheless, there are thought to be three main sources. One is basically the Gospel of Mark. One is a document that no trace of exists, but is hypothesized to be where Luke and Matthew get a certain amount of material that they have in common. That's called Q. But nobody knows whether that really existed, what language it would have been in, whether it was really written or perhaps an oral tradition. In any case, there was that. And then there is, then there, of course, were the individual experiences of various people who would have been reflected in what Luke wrote or Matthew wrote that are based on sort of eyewitness reports that they received themselves. And so those things are, you might say, how can I put it? How much of that would Paul have had contact with? He traveled with Mark, so presumably the accounts as reported in Mark were things he knew. To what extent he was dealing with other followers, many of whom did have first-hand experiences, so in those ways he got all sorts of accounts, which may or may not be, it's hard to say how they would have related to the gospel accounts. And then in addition, he has these mystical experiences that shape his own view of things. Would you like to
add anything?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things we might want to consider too is the nature of an oral culture. So we tend to think, someone heard a secondhand account from someone. Well, Paul's talking to people who were first-hand witnesses, so that's different from like the game of telephone. It's a culture where you sit around and tell stories to each other because you don't have television. So it's very likely if he's hanging around the apostles on a regular basis, especially when he was in Jerusalem, he's going to have heard most of the stories, probably more of the stories than we even have in the gospel accounts about Jesus and his life and his sayings.
Okay, yeah, good. There's an oral culture there that's much stronger than it is today. Though even today, an oral culture can be quite strong. How many of you were on campus when that shooting incident occurred? When was that? 2-3 years ago? You were in the library. Whoa, you were all right. This guy was very directly. I mean, at the time, I knew a lot about what was going on, even though my daughter, I didn't teach that day. I wasn't on campus. My daughter was taking a bus to her class and just got stopped at the edge of campus. They weren't allowing anyone on, so we just went and got breakfast tacos. But there weren't many news reports. But, she has all these Facebook friends and so on, so she's getting constant messages on her phone. Latest report from the library, or somebody's seeing this on the West Wall, blah, 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 blah. And so, there's a lockdown in Wagner Hall, et cetera, et cetera. One of my colleagues, by the way, was giving a lecture on Plato's political philosophy that day, was talking about how Plato says, look, death is unimportant. One should have courage and not fear death. And then there's this report received of the shooter. The guy says, you're all on your own, and runs. But anyway, stories like that certainly, and there's actually a lot of oral information that, the news reports actually end up being sort of minimalistic, but there's a lot of information passed between people, and a lot of it is highly reliable. So there's a huge amount of that. And in a culture where that was prized much more and valued much more, and you might say the success of accurate transmission was valued much more highly than it is today. Okay, so let's go back to our central question here. Why was he convinced nobody could follow the law? Yeah?
maybe because the law is reliant on the presence of sin, and in the eyes of Jesus Christ, everyone has sin.
Good, okay, yeah, here's another way to put this. Yeah, look, everybody sins. Okay, nobody can avoid that. Now why? There's this story in the gospel accounts of the rich young man coming up to Jesus saying, so what do I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus says, well, first of all, follow the commandments. Now notice that's an externalist answer, or at least it's the kind of answer that Paul's trying to argue against here, really. And what does he say? Well, I've done that. Now, Jesus says, oh, you have? Well, good. Now, maybe, you sound like the kind of guy who would be part of the inner circle. Maybe you'd like to be a disciple. Give up all that stuff and follow me. And he's like, but, now notice, is that really possible? Think about the various commandments. And let's focus just on the horizontal ones. Can you succeed in honoring your father and mother? For your whole life. Okay? Now, it's one thing to say, have you in general honored your father and mother? It's quite another thing to think, wait, always? You mean like never did anything disrespectful? Or I'll bet when you were 2, you did some pretty nasty stuff. But put that aside. What about the others? Do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness. Ooh, well, do not murder. I hope most of you can say, yeah, I'm good on that one. Do not steal. Well, I hope most of us are good on that one. Do not bear false witness. Like, never say anything negative about somebody else that's not true. That's harder. But then, when you get out the last one, do not covet. Okay? Now that's, I think, the hard one. That's what Paul says. Now notice it's the internal one. So that's why it's crucial at this point that actually it's not simply an internal-external question. Because it's really the internal commandment, the internal aspect of the law that says something about this. Can you really live your whole life not coveting? Okay, well now it depends what it means to covet, maybe. I'm good on my neighbor's donkey. I mean, I've never coveted a donkey. Well, what about other things? Can anybody really say they've never seen something somebody else had? Oh, wow, that's cool. I wish I had that. Right? Or seen a really attractive person and thought, whoa, that's a fancy. Or something. What other kinds of covenant? Or just
it's tenure. Someone else.
Yeah, right. Somebody else gets tenure, and partly you're happy for them, but partly it's like, dang, right? Or this friend of mine, starts a company around the same time I started a company, and my company is sort of doing nothing, but his company, he's getting all sorts of venture capital. It's probably worth $100 million at this point. It's like, and part I'm really happy for him. But there's a little part of me that says, why him and not me? The answer is because he works really hard. Hardly. But there are other factors. Anyway, that's something that, you might say, look, everybody does that at some point. Everybody at some point is a bit jealous of somebody else or desires something they really shouldn't desire, etc., etc. And so that's part of his argument. Nobody can fully pull it off. Nobody can really avoid violations at some point. Yeah. And
going back to the earlier question of how this relates to the words of Jesus Christ, in a way, Paul is very much in accord with Jesus' teaching ministry, in which he took all of the commandments and said, okay, you may be doing the external part of the commandment, you may not actually be sleeping with someone, but your wife probably doesn't appreciate it when you're looking at that other woman too, wanting to, right? Like that. So Christ was kind of articulating that the law, as stated, may have been focused on the external, but it also had an internal component. And Paul is bringing up that if you have to follow both the internal and the external components of the law, we're all sunk.
Good, exactly. Yes, in fact, it's really something that isn't in Mark, the Sermon on the Mount, or in another gospel, the Sermon on the Plain, that really is the crucial aspect here, where he brings out that internal component. In that one story I mentioned in Mark, yes, it's sort of like he's talking about the external, but in the Sermon on the Mount, it's all about the internal. Yeah.
And I think the law is just limited naturally because it's a general principle that can't be applied, or it can't completely conform to the nuances of particular situations. And so something like grace is needed to compensate for the law's limitation because it doesn't negate justice, but assumes it and perfects it.
Right. All right, that's a great point. I don't think that's a big theme in Paul, but if you think about the gospel stories, it really is a big theme and could be used for this. Look, the law needs, I'm just going to put it this way. The law needs to be applied with judgment, okay? Look at what the Pharisees do. Do we really find the Pharisees, for the most part of these gospel accounts, violating the law? We don't see them robbing people. We don't see them stealing or bearing false witness or other things. We find them lacking proper judgment, okay? They think, wait, no, it's terrible. You can't do that on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, oh, come on. You're telling me your child gets sick and needs water or needs medicine on the Sabbath and you won't do it? Give me a break. All of these laws require judgment. The world is complicated, and applying the rules properly requires careful judgment. Even about killing, for example. When is murder murder? And when is it something that would be lawful in wartime, let's say? That's complicated. That requires a lot of judgment. And so you might say, look, following the law really does require a great deal of judgment about what counts as what, when that's justified and when it's not. It's not a simple matter of applying rules algorithmically. But who has the required level of judgment? Maybe nobody. Yeah.
I was going to say, going back to the rich young man, like when he comes to Christ and asks, what can I do to attain eternal life? He's so oriented in the physical world that there's nothing you can really do. You can't buy it. You can't achieve it in a physical way. It's an internal state. And so the very question there is what makes him exempt. You know, that's kind of in his answer as he replies. And so that kind of goes back to, you know, I guess, what is it, 1 and 8?
Yes. Okay, notice what keeps that rich young man from following him is his attachment to things in this world. And so there is another kind of argument that can be given. And again, I don't find it a lot in Paul, but I do find it in the gospel accounts. It's what a Buddhist would refer to as attachment. People get attached to things in this world and don't always put God first. Okay? And if you think the commandment is, look, put God first in your life, people fail to do that in all sorts of ways. They're naturally attached to all sorts of other things. Yes, maybe the material things, as the rich young man was, but also to people. And at some point he says, look, you know, there can be conflicts between your obligations to your family, your obligations to your friends, your obligations to all sorts of things, and following what God really wants. And so those attachments to other things can be problems. Yeah.
If we make the assumption that God is a requirement for judgment, for right, or for justice, let's say.
Right.
Then where does that put Jesus Christ, for example, in that situation? Now you kind of balanced out no one can be justified with Christ died for no purpose. And then we assume below that Christ did die for a specific purpose.
Right.
Well, whatever that may be. But how can we say that God may influence judgment, whereas Jesus Christ doesn't, or vice versa?
Well,
or do we assume that judgment is acting upon or acting by the state, and thus the two are completely separate?
No. I'm not sort of pausing here because it's a bad question. I'm pausing here because it's a very deep question. in part, what you're asking is, look, I want to know more about this part and how that actually works. Okay, and that's a complicated question, and one that I agree with you is very important. I don't think Paul has a lot to say about it in Romans, though in other places in the New Testament it's an issue, and it does get developed in the tradition in various ways. Right now, Paul's concerned to say, look, God isn't looking just at your external behavior, but we don't know a lot else. In some accounts, God is acting as judge, and Jesus specifically is your lawyer. He's a defense attorney or something like that. And if you think of it those ways, then it's more than just died for some purpose. It's really, and is going to behave in a certain way, specifically with respect to this judgment. But that sort of takes us far from what's at stake at the moment. So I'm just going to issue you a promissory note and promise to come back to that later in the course. Yeah.
I got a comment about you actually. Well, maybe the law doesn't offer forgiveness or redemption, but Christ does, I guess.
Ah, right, good. Yes. So, exactly, what is this purpose? It has to do something with forgiveness, redemption, getting a positive judgment, right, and obtaining eternal life. Presumably, all of that is involved in this purpose. So, admittedly, you're right. It may be cheating to just say, for some purpose, look, there's the purpose here he has in mind is one connected to all of that, connected to justification, connected to salvation, connected to eternal life. And so, one way to respond to this argument, for example, would be saying, well, not for a purpose. It just had nothing to do with all that. It was something completely different. And so, really, it's a purpose of a certain kind that has to be filled into this argument to make it work. Because you're right. Otherwise, there isn't much of an argument. Yeah. I mean, really, if justification is through the law alone, this wouldn't follow unless we assume that the purpose you have in mind is somehow connected to justification. Okay, well those are some reasons why you might think 1A is true. There are a couple of others that I found in Paul. One of them is to say, look, I think of it as an argument for moral luck. Too often, whether you've kept the law is a matter of luck. It depends on external factors that you under control. Now, that means, in other words, you're trying to do the right thing. It brings us back to the kind of thing we were discussing right at the beginning. You've tried to do the right thing, but the circumstances don't cooperate. You're unlucky. And so the result is bad. Now, sometimes you might think, well, wait, I don't understand how you can just do something of this kind through bad luck. The rabbis at one point in the Talmud debate whether it's possible to rape someone accidentally. They come up with bizarre scenarios under which maybe this is possible. But anyway, it's surely possible to violate the laws in other ways, accidentally. Bearing false witness. Can you imagine violating that, but through no fault of your own, through bad moral luck? Yeah.
The being it's not your fault because the only other option would be that you die. Like you have to bear false testimony because otherwise you would die.
Well, that's sort of a case of, you're acting under coercion or something. We might indeed say you're not responsible in that kind of case. But I have in mind that, look, what you're doing wouldn't be wrong, except that you're unlucky. You're in this kind of situation where the world is an unexpected way. Yeah.
Just something out of context, hearing or seeing something out of context.
Okay, good. You hear or see something out of context, then you report it, right? And the inference you draw is entirely reasonable, and the person did say that, but the context wasn't what you think. And so you think you're reporting something accurately and warning somebody, for example, when it turns out, no, you really misunderstood. You tried to say something true, but in the end you bore false witness because actually you said something that wasn't true at all. But you had good evidence for believing it. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just that, gosh, it was not at all what a normal person would expect the situation to be.
I think another example is comes from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He says that a person's virtue is largely determined by their upbringing. So you might be really unlucky and be raised by great parents and develop.
Ooh, okay, good. There's that kind of moral luck where indeed you're brought up in the most totally wrong way, and you've got in that way a very difficult background to overcome. It might be that look, it's not your fault. It was just very bad moral luck that you brought up with those particular habits and those standards of judgment and so on. A last one is really an argument, as I see it, from essence. What is the essence of the law? Is it the external behavior, or is it in fact something internal? When we get a summary of the law, what does it say? I mean, the Ten Commandments provide a kind of summary, but they're mostly external. Do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not commit adultery, etc. But when Jesus summarizes the law, and when he's really echoing the Shema, and going back to that summary of the law in the Hebrew Bible, what is it? Yeah.
So, internal love. So,
Exactly.
and also, confirmed by Pauline argument that if I speak in tongues of mortals, if I have faith, all have not love. That is Pauline simple.
Nice. Okay, yes. Exactly. So really, love is the essence. Okay? Loving God. Loving your neighbor. And indeed, he does go on to say, look, even if you follow the law without love, if you follow the law with just pure fear, for example, then that's not, that doesn't get you a positive judgment. You just seem like a fearful coward then. We don't judge you as really a good person. And so love is the essence. But love is an internal state. Okay? And so the idea is, look, even if you think about the law itself, what do people take as fundamental in the law? It isn't the observance of certain things externally, it's something internal. Well, there are other arguments here we haven't gotten to. There's a sort of positive argument from promising or gifts. There's a positive argument from inheritance. That's all the stuff about Abraham. We've run out of time for that. I'll throw some notes on the website you can catch up